Okay, so hello everyone and welcome to our event this afternoon, which is AI Ethics and Wellbeing, which is being held as part of the Entrepreneurship Institute's Festival of Disruptive Thinking. Thank you so much for joining us. It's really great to have you with us. My name is Nina and it's a pleasure to moderate this event and welcome you all here today. I'm also joined by Joshua, one of our students at King's, who will be posting some additional information in the chat box for you. For those not familiar, the Entrepreneurship Institute supports students, staff and alumni at King's to develop their entrepreneurial mindsets. We believe that everyone can be entrepreneurial and that entrepreneurial people can help to make the world a better place by solving problems to create a healthier, smarter, more equal and sustainable future for all of us. This week's festival is showcasing our disruptive thinking skill, which is the ability to question and challenge the status quo of established systems to progress new ideas and ways of thinking. And we're so delighted that Dr. Sanjay Modgil has joined us today to share his experience of this to inspire you. Just a bit of housekeeping before we get started. This event is being recorded and will be shared afterwards. So please do mute your mics to prevent any background noise and turn off your cameras if you would prefer not to be on film. You can also enable live captions via the webinar settings, and there will be time for Q&A at the end of the presentation. The presentation will be about 25 minutes max, so please do drop your questions into the chat box and we'll come to these at the end. I know this is a super popular topic, so I know there's going to be lots of really interesting discussion towards the end. Now to introduce our speaker. Dr. Sanjay is a reader in artificial intelligence at the Department of Informatics in King's Faculty of Natural, Mathematical and Engineering Sciences. He is also a visiting professor at the Department of Philosophy at the University of Milan, and his teaching and research interests are in logic and the philosophy and ethics of artificial intelligence. Artificial intelligence has been a really popular topic across all of our events during the festival. So Sanjay, over to you. We're ready and we're eager to learn more.
Thank you, Nina. So I'm going to share my screen now, and hopefully you should all be able to see my presentation slides. So there we are. Hopefully everybody can see those.
Yep, we can see them fine, Sanjay.
Sure. Okay, so hello and thank you for that introduction, Nina, and thank you all for tuning in to what I hope will provoke you into appreciating how AI might unthinkingly be used in ways that undermine our well-being. So of course, there are of course many examples of beneficial uses of AI, for example, in healthcare or in self-driving cars that are expected to dramatically improve road safety. But like many technologies, the use of AI may be used in harmful ways, AI weapons systems, or the concern that AI may make human labor redundant. But in the focus of this talk, I'm going to address what is perhaps a less appreciated concern, the concern that AI may amplify and indeed reproduce human cognitive biases that evolution may have selected for, but that are ill adapted to promoting our present day conceptions of human well-being. So we have a responsibility to carefully understand how these biases operate, and how they may undermine our well-being, so that we can make sure that these cognitive biases are not amplified by the use of AI, or indeed reproduced in the design of AI. So I'm talking about cognitive biases rather than typically what is focused on, which is biased data. Biases in the way we think, the way we reason, the way in which we engage emotionally. So as a first example, consider what I call the consumption bias. See that the brain's reward mechanisms are mediated through the release of these pleasure-generating neurotransmitters like dopamine. And these mechanisms evolved to motivate behaviors in radically more harsh conditions than those of today. Our distant ancestors, upon encountering resources, be it an animal kill or a tree pregnant with fruit or materials for shelter, for survival, would have faced great competition for these resources, as well as uncertainty about when resources will become available again. And so evolution designed our reward system so that the pleasure that we actually experience when consuming or acquiring a resource is more short-lived than that which we anticipated. Therefore, the pleasuring feelings subside very quickly. After you consume the fruit or the kill, or you acquire some material good, the pleasure you get subsides quickly. And this makes sense because if the pleasure subsides quickly, if it's very short-lived, our ancestors would have then been motivated to continue in the search for resources and the reward of those pleasure-generating neurotransmitters. After all, imagine that pleasure upon a consumption lasted for a long time. Well, then there would be little motivation to continue searching for more resources, to get more of the fix. There would have been, and this would not have been good for their survival, given the difficulty of acquiring resources. But in our current environment, resources are far more plentiful and available. And we are privileged enough to develop and nurture more sustainable, meaningful sources of well-being in the form of, self-development, spiritual practice, relationships with others, altruism. Our well-being is not so dependent on these kind of basic sort of requirements for material, for food. And indeed, happiness studies show that beyond acquiring a certain level of resources needed for meeting these basic needs, more consumption, more acquisition of material things does not correlate with increased happiness. But our ancestral brains are still wired, right, to continue consuming and acquiring. They're still wired for that short-term dopamine fix that brings fleeting pleasure. And so we engage in comfort eating and comfort shopping. And the kind of withdrawal symptoms, if you like, that accompany the quick fall off in pleasure sensations drives us to eat more, to shop more. And this consumption bias is exploited by capitalism's injunction to consume, consume, consume. This unfettered consumerism that capitalism incentivizes feeds and perpetuates this bias and the myth that consumption and acquiring things equates with well-being. Now, this entrenchment of the bias and perpetuation of the happiness myth is in danger of being dramatically amplified by uses of artificial intelligence. And to give one example, in 2017, there was a leaked Facebook document in which Facebook boasted to advertisers that their AI algorithms can predict, based upon the clicking behavior on the sites that teenagers are visiting, they could predict with a high degree of accuracy when teenagers are feeling insecure or depressed or anxious. And this, they said, would be the ideal time for advertisers to target those teenagers with adverts, because that's when they're most vulnerable to wanting that dopamine fix, that fleeting feeling of pleasure. This would be when they are most vulnerable to a comfort buy, right? So this would be the ideal time to target them with adverts that are more likely to elicit the short-term dopamine hit of a comfort buy. They're just kind of reverting to that kind of ancestral wiring where they're feeling vulnerable and they want that quick fix of acquiring or consuming in order to feel good. But of course, this is not sustainable. This by no means is what constitutes sustainable well-being or well-being more deeply understood given our current environment. And so the danger is with the uses of AI, these kinds of uses of AI, is that from a young age, the association of consumption with well-being will become more and more entrenched by the uses of AI in identifying when consumers are most in need of a dopamine-mediated consumption fix. I mean, we see this throughout the uses of internet and on social media, where even notifications, smiles, they're all designed to give that quick fix of dopamine, to give that fleeting moment of pleasure. And the uses of AI in targeting in this way is simply it's entrenching the myth. It's perpetuating the myth that these short dopamine, these little instant highs, is what constitutes well-being, when we know from studies that they don't constitute sustainable well-being. So let's now turn to a bias associated with our reasoning, what's called the confirmation bias, which is the tendency to process information by looking for or interpreting information that is consistent, that supports what we already believe. Now, again, this bias can be explained by accounts of how the capacity for system 2 reasoning evolved. Now, system 2 reasoning is essentially that kind of explicit, conscious, deliberative type reasoning. This is as opposed to system 1, which is instinctive. When you move to catch a ball, you're not kind of consciously working out the trajectory of the ball, where your hands are, etc. That's system 1. System 2 reasoning is the kind of reasoning when you consciously plan an event or weigh up arguments for and against whether you should believe or do something. Now, there are two accounts of how this capacity evolved. In the Machiavellian, so-called Machiavellian account, this kind of reasoning evolved in situations where humans wanted to convince others. Imagine some individual A wanting to convince some individual B that X is true, or that we should do Y. Now, in these social situations, B is wary of being manipulated by A, right? So A says to B, look, you should believe X, or you should do Y. But B kind of think, well, I don't want to be manipulated. So B is incentivized to look for reasons or arguments against what A is saying, against X or Y. A, of course, knows that B is so incentivized, and therefore A is motivated to seek reasons and evidence confirming that X is the case or that Y is the best course of action. So you see there that this account of how reasoning evolved in social situations accounts for why an individual like A is kind of inherently motivated to seek or attend to reasons or evidence that confirms what they believe or what they intend to do. Now, in cooperative accounts, the idea is that the impetus for development of system 2 reasoning, of explicit reasoning, was what's called the division of epistemic labor. So imagine an individual A has reason to believe that the food source lies to the north, whereas B has reason to believe that the food sources, the source of food, the herd of animals lies to the south. Now, rather than A and B both seeking out reasons and evidence for both possibilities, it of course would be more efficient if they divided up the kind of epistemic labor, the reasoning labor, so that A would look for reasons to confirm his belief that the food is to the north. B seeks reasons to confirm her belief that the food is to the south. So in both these accounts of how we evolved the capacity to reason explicitly, the confirmation bias seems to be a side effect, a natural outcome of how reasoning evolved. Now, in the distant past, the raw material from which information could be gleaned to confirm our beliefs was information gleaned or gathered from our neighbors. Indeed, at this stage, the confirmation bias may well have served a useful purpose, right? At this stage in our evolution, the confirmation bias may have actually served to entrench, to make more rigid beliefs related to values, to ways in which a given group or tribe might organize itself. By making such kind of value-laden or political beliefs or organizational beliefs more resistant to challenge through confirmation, they became, if you like, articles of faith that then served to strengthen the bonds and to foster cooperation and kinship within these groups, within these tribes. So these beliefs, by being by all the members of a tribe or group mutually confirming, right, and solidifying these beliefs, they became articles of faith. And these articles of faiths kind of served to kind of bind the members of the group together, right, and promote cooperation. At the same time, this binding of the group, the kinship, would strengthen the resolve of these groups to resist attacks and encroachment of their territory and theft of their resources by other tribes, by other neighboring groups in neighboring territories. So we can see how in the early days, in the early stage of our evolution, the confirmation bias might have had a useful purpose to kind of strengthen intra-group and intra-tribal bonds. Of course, then with the advent of conventional media, TV, newspapers, the raw material, if you like, the information from which one could draw on to confirm our beliefs increased significantly. We were not just reliant on information we received from other people, but information we got from kind of conventional media. And then, of course, with the internet now and social media, we witness a vastly greater increased informational pool from which we can draw on to confirm our beliefs, our opinions. We now live in a very, very different situation. And this is exactly what the AI filtering algorithms are doing. So we have these filtering algorithms in social media, and what they do is they infer our opinions, a social media user's opinions and views. They infer our opinions and views from our past history of what we consume as users on the internet, the sites we visit, the feeds we get. And what they do, these filtering algorithms, is from all the vast amount of information, they then selectively feed us with more of the same. Effectively, they're just providing us with more and more information that confirms what we already believe, but now from a vast, much bigger pool of information. In fact, if you think about it, and you may have experienced this yourself, when you have your beliefs confirmed, right, your views kind of supported, it's inherently satisfying. And so you can see how the filtering algorithms, by satisfying us, through confirmation of our beliefs, engage our attention more. We are motivated to spend more time on the internet because we get this feeling of satisfaction from our beliefs being confirmed. And of course, that's all for the good, right? Because the more attention we give, the more we're exposed to adverts. Our attention is the most valuable resource for advertisers. So you can see that the filtering algorithms are in effect technological incarnations of the confirmation bias. They do the filtering. They filter out the information that confirms what we believe. They're kind of technological incarnations of the confirmation bias, massively amplifying the bias by drawing on vastly more information that is selectively filtered to confirm and so entrench our beliefs and opinions. In other words, to make our beliefs and opinions much, much more resistant to challenge. I mean, if you think, if any of you, many of you have experienced those kind of YouTube rabbit holes, right? You watch one video promoting vaccine conspiracies, and then subsequent recommendations further entrench your belief in the conspiracy. And now, the opinions and beliefs that are related to values and politics, etc., get more deeply entrenched through the use of these filtering algorithms. But rather than, as in our early evolution, rather than these opinions and beliefs serving to bind and strengthen pre-existing groups that need to cooperate and protect their territory and resources, these beliefs, these opinions actually end up defining the tribes, right? You have the anti-vax tribe, the climate denying tribe, and so on. And members of opposing tribes are not now separated and living in different territories, but live side by side, within neighborhoods, within families. And the more that we become entrenched in these tribes, the less likely we will achieve consensus, right? After all, a shared understanding of what is the case is needed to deal with the pressing problems that face humanity, from pandemics to climate change. So we can see how these filtering algorithms that use AI techniques to kind of predict what we like, what our opinions are, what our views are, and feed us with more, are ending up are indirectly leading to kind of division and rancor within groups and societies, and compromising our capacity to come to an agreed shared understanding, and therefore an agreed and shared understanding of the best way forward. Now, let's consider moral biases, in particular, the means end, or what's called the means end or side effect distinction. What we're concerned about is that we don't want to reproduce these biases in the moral reasoning of artificial intelligence. See, as AI becomes more independent and capable of acting in a way that has ethical impact, they may need to make tricky moral decisions. So imagine in this picture, you've got a self-driving car with 4 occupants hurtling towards 5 individuals that have stepped out onto a crossing. Okay. The AI algorithm is faced with a choice. Does it go straight on and kill the 5, or does it swerve to the left, knowing that there is a roadblock there and that the crash would kill the 4 occupants? Right. So that's an example of a kind of moral dilemma, a slightly artificial example, but hey ho, it just kind of like illustrates a point. Now, the question is, should we design AI to reproduce the moral reasoning of humans? Let's see if we can kind of answer that question by looking at what's called the well-known trolley thought experiments. Now, these are kind of thought experiments designed to investigate how humans reason morally. Consider the scenario A on the left. Right? You've got a trolley. You're on a trolley, hurtling towards 5 workers tied down on a track. Okay. Now, you can at point X switch the trolley onto the side track, knowing that there is 1 worker there. What do? Well, the majority of people would switch the trolley onto the side track, killing the 1, which is much better, of course, than killing 5. But now consider a variation on this on this scenario. In situation B, the trolley is hurtling towards 5, but the only way you can save these 5 is by pushing a man with a backpack off the bridge, right, onto the track, and so effectively the man will act as a trolley stopper, and the 5 will be saved, but the 1 will be killed. Now, the calculus, if you like, is the same there, right? The end result is that 1 dies instead of 5. But in this case B, only 31% typically. These are typical figures of when they ask the question, what would you do? A typical figure is about 30% would push the man over the bridge, very much less than the 87% in scenario A. Now, what accounts for this difference? Well, it's been shown that what is crucial in scenario B, what accounts for less people being willing to choose to kill one instead of five, is that we have an emotional aversion to physical force, but not just an aversion to physical force, a physical act of pushing the man, but also combined with another factor is that in scenario B, right, the man on the bridge is being used as a means to an end. You see, in scenario A, the death of the one is a side effect of the action of pulling the switch. After all, if there were no worker tied down there, the five would be saved. You would switch the trolley to the right track, and all well and good. So if you think counterfactually, if the worker were not there, all well and good, the five would be saved. But in scenario B, in the bridge scenario, the man being pushed over the bridge is crucial to achieving the goal of saving the five. The man has to be there in order to save the five. The man is used as a means, right, to the end, towards the goal of saving the five. So there is this kind of distinction between means end and side effects that affects our moral thinking. And this distinction is witnessed in law. For example, in the law of armed conflict, knowing, I mean, you can launch an attack knowing that civilian deaths will result as what they call collateral damage, as a side effect of an attack. Okay, or you can launch an attack to intentionally kill the same number of civilians. But the former, rather than the latter, is sanctioned by laws of armed conflict. So laws of armed conflict make this moral distinction between means end and side effect. But arguably, there is no morally salient reason to make this distinction. Some philosophers disagree, but I'm certainly convinced that there is no morally salient reason to this distinction. Rather, the distinction is an artifact of our cognitive limitations. You see, when we envisage a plan of action, right, towards achieving some goal, we focus on the chain of cause and effect. This action causes effect one, which causes another effect, and so on towards that goal. We keep in view, right, the effects on the line on the direct line of cause and effect to the goal. But of course, any action has many side effects. Right? Think of the butterfly effect, right? The well-known butterfly effect. You know, one small action leads to a whole, you know, almost infinite amount of side effects. And cognitively, it's just not possible, right? It's not possible to keep all these side effects in view, in mind. We only keep the effects in the chain of cause and effect from action to goal, from means to end. And only the effects in this directly perceivable chain of cause and effect leading from the action or the means to the goal push our moral alarm buttons, push our moral emotions, engage our moral emotions. Because those are all the huge, almost infinite amount of side effects of an action are not in view. They don't push our moral buttons, right? They don't engage our moral alarm system. And this explains why we make this moral distinction, because we're only really engaged, our moral emotions are only engaged by the immediate and perceivable effects rather than all the additional side effects. So now the question is, should this distinction, given what I've just said, be accounted for when we design the moral decision making of artificial agents? Finally, I'm going to come to what's called the anthropomorphic bias. Okay, so this is the tendency to ascribe human-like characteristics, usually mental properties or agency, or, for example, ascribing the idea that at an age someone is conscious, some entity is conscious, to things that do not have it. And it's exhibited at a very young age. I mean, going way back, you've heard of sort of these special dolls or little toy soldiers or whatever designed to exhibit human-like behaviors, and toddlers, very young children, kind of starting to develop kind of empathetic kind of relations with these toys, thinking that there's some rich inner conscious life in these inanimate objects. There are experiments sort of showing, for example, very young toddlers showing a circle with eyes and a kind of what looks like a face propelling itself up a slope, and a square object helping it up the slope, a triangular object kind of resisting its progress. And then after being shown this, the toddlers will preferentially reach for square toys rather than triangular toys. There's a kind of they're looking. It looks like that they're reading intentions and the desire to help or obstruct in these shapes. And also, of course, this bias is exhibited by the not so young. There was recently a Google engineer put on leave for claiming that a Google chatbot had become sentient. Now, this anthropomorphic bias, I'm going to suggest, does have some dangers, in particular because we can anticipate that the initial commercial use of robots, when we start to really see robots being used in everyday society, most likely they will be used in the elderly care sector, given the shortage of social care, and in the sex industry. Moreover, there'll be a commercial imperative to make them as human-like as possible, right? To exhibit behaviors such as suggesting empathy or arousal. In the case of the elderly care sector, what you can imagine that the robots would be designed to be human-like so that the elderly feel like they're really being cared for, they're being empathized with. In the case of the sex industry, the sex robot, if your partner is a sex robot, there will be an incentive to make those robots look and appear like they really are enjoying and being aroused. And of course, these behaviors will engage and trigger the anthropomorphic bias, right? The anthropomorphic ascription of a rich inner conscious life in these robots. And what we'll then end up doing is engaging in a kind of master-slave relationship with entities, with these robots, that to all intents and purposes, we consider to be as conscious as humans. So the question is, how might this affect our relationship with other humans, right? How will it affect our attitude to slavery, in fact? How will it affect our sexual relationship with human partners if from a young age, like with internet porn, our understanding of the sexual acts is so distorted that we think of sex as something that we can just get on demand, and that our sex, as it were, slave, a sex robot, is just there to serve our whims. How will that bleed over? How will that affect the way we engage sexually with human partners? In the same way that there are concerns about the overuse of internet porn from a young age, affecting the capacity to have healthy sexual relationships. How might our sense of responsibility to the elderly be affected, given that we are outsourcing care to entities that empathetically engage with the elders? Think about sat-nav. I mean, the ability to read maps has probably declined because we become so reliant on sat-nav. Would our capacity for empathizing or for caring or our feeling of responsibility to elders be similarly decline? So these are kind of all issues that might arise, and when we think about the effects of the anthropomorphic bias and the possibility of designing human-like robots that would trigger the bias, so that we would think that they are in fact conscious by virtue of their behaviors. So I'm now going to conclude with the last 2 or 3 minutes of this talk. Nina, how much time do I have left? Just remind me, if any.
You've got a couple of minutes, so yeah, wrapping up sounds good.
Okay, so what I want to suggest finally is what should we do now? What can we start to do now to address these issues? One way forward, I would argue, is to develop innovative uses of AI to counteract these concerns. So, for example, research I do in my research, my research is on kind of logical models of reasoning and debate and dialogue, and the long-term aim would be the development of these kind of Socratic AIs, these like apps on a phone or on a computer. These Socratic AIs equipped with skills in logical reasoning, in dialogue, in argument and debate. The long-term vision is that these kind of Socratic AIs would be embedded in education, right? Engaging students in debate, rewarding students for changing their views on a topic, kind of inculcating in them skills of critical engagement with information from an early age, so that from a young age, right, students and citizens are not just consuming information, not just consuming it, but engaging critically with information. And this can be something that can be brought into the educational curriculum from a young age. And the work I do is on developing logical models of debate and dialogue and critical reasoning that could be implemented in these Socratic AIs. We want to arm the citizens of the future so that they don't just unreflectively sort of give in to kind of post-truth, polarized and fragmented dystopia that we're beginning to witness now. This is an example of a Socratic AI, which we might look at in the question and answer session if anyone's interested. Another example is the use of AI virtual reality as a kind of ultimate sort of empathy machine. But we can, again, that's another example. And if anyone's interested, we can have a look at that in the Q&A session. I can explain a bit about how such AI virtual reality might enhance our empathetic engagement with people different to us, right? By effectively putting us in their place, by dropping us, as it were, in the midst of a scene in which we then interact with people very unlike us. And finally, I really do think we need to think carefully about government regulation, right? But not just government regulation, kind of uninformed government regulation, but government regulation informed by joined up multidisciplinary SAGE AI. You remember at the time of the COVID crisis, you had a panel of experts, what they call SAGE, that basically guided and advised the government. We need the same, right? Because hopefully, as this presentation has tried to demonstrate, we need a kind of holistic understanding, not just in the case of cognitive biases, but across the board of how AI might cause harms, what we should do about it, and what are the right kinds of, in the case of cognitive biases, what are the right ways to kind of ameliorate and counteract them, so that we would have in such a SAGE AI developers and designers, anthropologists, social scientists, etc., answering questions like, will anthropomorphism affect our relationship with other humans? Should we regulate against the use of behavioral predictions? Should and which moral philosophers should inform how we implement and design the moral reasoning of AI? In the same way that in the past we have, I mean, in the UK, for example, for the moral philosopher Lady Warnock was brought on board by the government to advise on the regulation of stem cell research, new technologies in vitro fertilization. We need the input from these multidisciplinary teams to advise on regulation and thereby the design and implementation and uses of artificial intelligence. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Sanjay. Very thought-provoking. I really enjoyed all the questions, the open questions that you were posing all the way through, helping us to really, think about what the implications for all of us, I guess, as we move forward. And I can tell it's been really fascinating. We've already had a question in the chat box. So George has asked early on that you argued that capitalism exploits our evolutionary biases, but given capitalism is strengthened by them, can you imagine a post-capitalist society that would be able to overcome the evolutionary biases that you outlined, or are they too strong? And a second question, I guess, as part of that is, can we design AI to help rather than hinder transition to such a society? And how, especially if the ownership of the technology is in the hands of those with vested interests, against such a transition?
Yeah, okay, thank you. I mean, that's a big question. I should say that I didn't want to sound Marxist, or sort of like it wasn't a Marxist rant against capitalism. It's uh, I'd hedge by saying that, look, it's about unfettered sort of laissez-faire capitalism, the kind of unreflective, right, exploitation of the consumption bias. Because, you know, there are, I mean, I would say that there are many goods that capitalism delivers, but it's about regulating, it's about regulation to ensure that the worst aspects of capitalism are not perpetuated. And I do think that this exploitation of the consumption bias, which is kind of an evolutionary acquired bias, is something that I think is potentially a real threat to the well-being of humans. But coming to the question, well, what can we do about it? Well, of course, if it's an evolutionary acquired bias, we have to work quite hard to kind of counteract those hardwired biases. But we do that already, right? I mean, we have evolutionary biases that really favor empathetic, altruistic, charitable engagement with people who are genetically related, or to us, or people who live within a community. But we've evolved moral. I mean, arguably, a measure of moral progress is the extent to which we empathize and are altruistic towards people far removed from us in distant lands, very much unlike us. So again, now sort of following on, coming to the question, so this is kind of an analogous situation, and but it's an analogy worth focusing on, because it's actually come to the idea I suggested before. Imagine now the use of AI virtual reality, in a geography class or in a history class, right? And students are dropped in to a situation where they may, like in a geography class, like in a poorer part of the world where there's poverty. Of course, it has to be sensitively handled so that they don't come out of the virtual reality traumatized, right, and have PTSD, because that's just a whole bunch of other problems. But right, so you could imagine VR being used to kind of expand the circle of moral concern, to engage our kind of empathy and our altruistic instincts, right? Now, again, this is the use of AI, note, to kind of counteract what is a very kind of quite deep-seated evolutionary bias towards which favors the well-being of people genetically related to us. So I've kind of given an analogous example where you could use AI to counteract these evolutionary biases. The other example, the Socratic AI that I suggested, right, is again an example of counteracting the confirmation bias. So that from a young age, right, we are kind of through nurture, right, as opposed to nature, cultivating more of an acceptance, more of a readiness to engage critically with information, to be more aware of our own biases, to reward ourselves when we change our mind. I mean, I don't want to, this might sound a bit pretentious or a bit holier than thou, but I mean, it's a matter of fact that I have noticed in myself that I started recently to sort of congratulate myself when my mind was changed on something that I kind of had a conviction in. And I kind of like gave myself a little pat on the back, a reward. And I am noticing just a slight kind of increased readiness to sort of have my mind changed, and I'm feeling slightly more open. Let's put it that way, to being challenged and having my mind changed. So I hope that kind of gives us an answer to the question.
Thanks, Sanjay. Any other questions? You're more than welcome to raise your hand and ask Sanjay directly if you're happy to unmute, or pop them in the chat. I think Charlotte had a particular interest in that Socratic AI that you were talking about. Charlotte, if there's anything in particular you'd like to know more about, please do feel free to let Sanjay know.
Hi, yeah, thank you so much. I found this fascinating, and I think you're absolutely right. One of the main problems kind of I see in society these days is people not being open to changing their minds. So I've had the same kind of journey as you recently of being like, actually, it's a positive thing when my convictions have been challenged. But yeah, I saw the slides on the the AI, and I just wanted to know a little bit more about kind of when that could be implemented. What do you think the best uses are? You just covered a little bit of that before, though.
Yeah, so thank you, Charlotte. Yeah, I think when it would be implemented, I think it's some time off, because there are a bunch of researchers here at King's, including myself, and at other places, where we're looking at kind of formalizing, as it were, the processes, the kind of logical steps one takes in a dialogue, such that one can bring arguments for and against certain claims and have them evaluated, right? So there's a lot of work being done theoretically. There is some work on the practical side of things. IBM had a grand challenge. So, IBM have had a number of grand challenges. One was the grand challenge was to develop a computer that would beat the world champion. And they successfully did that with Deep Blue and with Gary Kasparov many, many years ago. But the more recent grand challenge was to develop an AI that could debate a human, and such that an audience could say, well, the AI actually won the debate, and they met that challenge, right? They succeeded in that challenge. So you could imagine these kinds of AIs being used. I mean, take later education. For example, medical students, when they are learning about how to diagnose medical conditions, typically a consultant is on the ward and will challenge and say, well, what if this were the case? What if this were the case? Challenge them, getting to them engaged in a kind of dialogue, and that improves their ability to diagnose. Well, you could imagine medical students, in a lecture room with a kind of a Socratic AI playing the role of a consultant, right? Challenging and questioning. The example I showed on the slides was of an AI engaging a student in a debate on abortion, and the AI I won't go through it now, but I went through a series of logical steps in which the AI reveals in the argument of the student who claims that abortion is wrong a contradiction. Right? Because basically the student says, well, look, a fetus's life is sacred, and if a life is sacred, it should not be destroyed. But later on, the student is questioned on their views on the death penalty, and they say they're in favor of the death penalty. Right? So this reveals a contradiction, and the student says, well, okay, and you can formalize and model this in a very logical, clear way. The student says, well, okay, I'll refine my review to all life is sacred except those that take the life of another. Now that student can consistently be against abortion, but for the death penalty. And then the Socratic AI says, but what about the executioner who pulls a switch? They're taking the life of another. Or what if the fetus endangers the life of the mother? Okay, so you can break down the way this kind of dialectic dialogue proceeds in a logical way. And the ultimate aim is to encode this kind of way of engaging dialogically through argument and debate in these kind of Socratic AIs and embed them in educational settings.
Thanks, Sanjay. We've got a hand up from Luca. I'll hand over to him to ask his question, and then I think that might be the last one. So over to you, Luca.
Thank you, Nina, and thank you, Sanjay. I mean, fascinating as usual. Let me ask a slightly upside down question. Sure. Do you think that we, and with we, I mean developers, scientists, and everything, have a moral obligation to develop AI that is similar to us? Or to say it differently, do you think it is okay to try and conceive of AIs which are very different from us? And if so, where would you put the limit? Let me explain what I mean. Sorry, it's a bit complicated. If we develop AI that is similar to us, we know what we are doing, and we in a sense, and we know what we are dealing with, because it's basically what we deal with in our daily lives. If we try and experiment a bit more, we might end up with creating laws of thought, but also appearances that are very, very different from our normal life. And how could we control that?
Yeah. So thanks, Luca. I mean, that's a fascinating question because, of course, you know, we have this kind of anthropocentric kind of understanding of what intelligence is, right? So intelligence is what human intelligence is. There may be much more exotic forms of intelligence, very different to ours. That I would be concerned about by that, because we would, as you suggest, lose control, right? We would not be able to retain any kind of control. So actually, coming back to the initial question, I hadn't really thought about this. I think we do have a moral obligation. So this is my off the bat kind of instinctive answer. We do have a moral obligation to make sure that we design artificial intelligence to be similar to human intelligence, where human intelligence serves us well. I mean, that's the point in some sense of this presentation, that in some cases, human intelligence doesn't serve us well because of biases, cognitive biases that were appropriate for a very different environment, but are not conducive to well-being in the environment we live in. So I would kind of hedge the answer by saying, yes, we have a moral obligation to design AIs that reproduce or simulate human intelligence, where those aspects of human intelligence serve us well. And that's, I think, going to be the really, really tricky question to answer.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sanjay. It's super fascinating. I'm sure we could keep going all evening with lots of very interesting questions, and I hope you can see the chat. There's a lot of positive comments coming through for you. So thank you so much for that amazing presentation and for also contributing to our Festival of Disruptive Thinking. And thank you so much to everyone who has joined us this afternoon. Joshua is now going to share a link in the chat to subscribe to our Entrepreneurship Institute newsletter, which is the best way to find out about events just like this. But all that's left for me to say is a huge thank you to Sanjay. Really interesting, really fascinating, and lots to think about. I'm pretty sure before I go to bed tonight, it's all going to be whirring around and I'm still going to be trying to answer these big questions, which is a really great place to be. So huge thank you, and thank you to everyone for joining us as well, and hopefully see you soon.
Thank you very much. Thank you all for tuning in. Much appreciated. Thanks. Bye-bye.